The wonders of the deep and the stubborn shore. The morning sun began to stretch its golden fingers over the vast estate of the Clampett family, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grass that always felt a bit too fancy for Jed Clampett. He was a man of simple roots, a man who had found a fortune in the ground but kept his heart in the hills. On this particular morning, the air was filled with the sounds of a very unusual training session. Jed stood by, watching with a mixture of amusement and patience as his nephew, Jethro Bodine, was once again attempting to prove that he possessed a superior intellect to the family dog, Duke. Jethro was on all fours, his large frame moving with a clumsy grace as he crawled through the dirt. He looked at Duke with intense concentration and spoke with a voice full of earnest instruction, telling the old hound dog to watch closely because he was going to show him one more time how to fetch a stick. Ellie Mae, Jed's beautiful and animal-loving daughter, stepped out and watched the scene with a sigh. She asked Jethro if he could not do that out back, explaining that Mark was coming by, and she did not want him to see Jethro crawling around like a nut. Jethro stopped his crawling and looked up, offended. He asked her who she was calling a nut, and Ellie Mae pointed out the obvious, noting that he had been trying to teach that dog to fetch a stick for 10 years. Jethro, ever confident in his own abilities, defended himself by saying that it takes time because Duke just is not as bright as he is. Jed joined the conversation, asking the young man what he was doing. Jethro repeated his mission of teaching Duke to fetch, emphasizing that he did not want Mark to see the dog's lack of progress. Granny, the feisty and diminutive matriarch of the family, marched into the yard with a purposeful stride. She told them not to worry and called Duke over, claiming she had something a lot better than fetching sticks. She produced a nice juicy bone and held it out for the dog. Jethro watched in disbelief as the bone was offered to Duke. He grumbled that it was an odd dog and complained that while he did all the tricks, the dumb old hound dog got the reward. Granny, never one to mince words, suggested that Jethro take Duke around back and share the bone with him. Jethro was horrified by the suggestion, asking if she really expected him to gnaw on the same bone with an old hound dog. He declared that it was what one would call unsanitary. Jed nodded in agreement, adding that Duke might catch something if he shared with Jethro. Granny told Jethro and Duke to make themselves scarce, and as they headed toward the back of the house, Jethro let out a shout of excitement. He told Uncle Jed that Duke had finally done it. The dog had picked up the stick, though Jethro suspected Duke was only taking it around back, so Jethro could fetch it for him some more. A moment later, Mark Templeton arrived. He was a young Navy lieutenant with a passion for the ocean and a growing affection for Ellie Mae. Jed greeted him warmly, but he also offered a word of caution. He told Mark not to say anything to Granny about going in the water or making Ellie Mae into a frog woman, as the mere mention of it set the old woman off. Mark understood the challenge, but believed he had a way to win her over. He suggested that if Granny could ever see the fascinating world that lies under the surface of the ocean, she might change her mind. Jed was skeptical, stating that there was nobody who was going to get that little woman under the water. However, Mark had come prepared with a projector, a screen, and some underwater film. He believed that once Granny saw the wonders that exist in the ocean depths, she would be as hooked as everyone else. The piece was suddenly interrupted by Granny's shouts. She was being carried toward the house by Mark, who was trying to get her to sit down for the movie. She screamed for Ellie to help her, convinced that Mark was going to drown her in the bottom of the ocean. Jed tried to calm her, explaining that Mark was only taking her there on film. Granny was not convinced, shouting that he was not taking her there on anything. Eventually, they managed to get her settled. Mark explained that exploring under the sea was necessary for the survival of the human race because people would eventually have to learn to farm the sea to feed the world. As the film began, Granny watched with deep suspicion. She looked at the beautiful coral and sea life and remarked that it looked like the time the creek rose and flooded the potato patch. When Mark spoke of farming the sea, Granny predicted that the farmers would surely have rusty plows. The sight of a manta ray on the screen prompted Granny to call it an underwater bat, and she insisted that fish only looked good in a skillet. Mark tried to explain that many scientists believe humans originally came from the sea, but Granny firmly replied that the only sea she came from was Tennessee. Ellie Mae was enchanted by the footage, expressing a deep desire to see it for herself, which only fueled Granny's frustration. Granny told Mark to give up this frogman nonsense and be a cowboy instead. She envisioned him as a range-riding, calf-roping cowboy who should raise babies instead of guppies. Jed apologized for Granny being set in her ways, noting that one could plant that little woman and grow 10 acres of stubborn. Despite Granny's protests, Jed admitted he liked the picture, though it did make him hungry for fish. Meanwhile, at the bank, Milburn Drysdale was preparing for a very important visitor. He was dressed in a Navy uniform and was limping noticeably. When his loyal secretary, Jane Hathaway, arrived, she was bewildered by the scene. Mr. Drysdale explained that he wanted to impress Lieutenant Mark Templeton. He knew that if Mark married Ellie Mae, the young man would eventually have access to a fortune of $40 or $50 million. Jane reminded him that the last time Mark was there, Mr. Drysdale had thrown him out. Drysdale dismissed this, claiming it was just the natural resentment of a lowly sailor toward an officer. He insisted on being called Spunky Drysdale of the United States Navy and claimed his limp was from a shark bite. He ordered Jane to think of the bank as a ship, where he was the skipper and she was the crew. Back at the Clampett estate, Jed and Mark were discussing the future. Jed was genuinely impressed by Mark's vision for oceanography and the intelligent use of ocean resources. He mentioned that he had a lot of money, somewhere between $95 and $100 million. Jed mused about the idea of taking $40 or $50 million and putting it into marine research. Mark was thrilled, unable to think of a better cause. They decided to talk more about it after Mark's appointment with Mr. Drysdale. When Mark arrived at the bank, he was greeted by the sight of Mr. Drysdale in full naval regalia. Drysdale welcomed him to the bridge and spoke of how the Navy was in his blood. He claimed that the Navy had taught him how to run the bank with character, integrity, and courage. Mark was touched by the display, especially when Drysdale spoke of his love for the sea. However, the mood shifted instantly when Mark mentioned Jed's plan to donate $50 million to oceanography. Mr. Drysdale's face turned pale. He shouted that the idea was for the birds and called for Miss Hathaway to throw Mark out. He went from being a proud sailor to a man in a state of panic, screaming that Mark was a maniac who wanted to throw $50 million into the ocean. He ordered Mark to be locked in a brig and the key thrown away. Later, Mr. Drysdale called Granny to warn her. He told her that Mark Templeton was as nutty as a fruitcake and that they had to stop him from marrying Ellie Mae. Granny agreed, mentioning that she had always thought he had a frog brain. They decided to seek the help of Dr. Klingner, a psychiatrist who shared an office building with the bank. Granny was convinced that the doctor could work a miracle and change Mark back from his froggy ways. At the Clampett house, the family was preparing for another scuba lesson at the cement pond. Jethro arrived, having just finished an enormous meal consisting of 24 pizzas, spaghetti, meatballs, and various other Italian dishes. They headed to the pool, where Mark, Jed, and Ellie Mae were already in their gear. Granny watched them from a distance, her heart heavy with the belief that they were turning into frogs right before her eyes. When she saw 4 figures in the water, she was certain that Jethro had also succumbed to the transformation. Dr. Klingner arrived at the estate, accompanied by Jane Hathaway. He was a professional who wanted to help Granny overcome her extreme fear of water, known as aquaphobia. He planned to put on a scuba demonstration to show her that the water was not a place of magic or danger. He asked to be alone with Granny when she arrived. The family went to the dressing room to give him space. When Granny saw the doctor in his scuba suit, she was devastated. She thought he had also turned into a frogman. She pleaded with him to get out of the water before it was too late, lamenting that there would be no one left to change him back. Granny found a large sack and, seeing a frog nearby, she captured it, believing it was the doctor. She then encountered a young woman who revealed she was Dr. Klingner's wife. Granny felt a wave of sympathy for the woman, telling her that she had the better part of her marriage and now she had the worse. She showed the woman the sack, claiming her husband was inside. The doctor's wife played along with a gentle kindness, and Granny reminded her of the story where a girl kisses a frog to turn him into a prince. She urged the woman to try it, promising to leave so they could have their privacy. As Granny departed, feeling she had done her duty, the real Dr. Klingner emerged from the water, safe and sound. His wife greeted him with a smile, holding the frog and joking about his handsome appearance. The misunderstanding was resolved with laughter, and the family gathered once more, thankful for the bonds that held them together, whether on land or near the sea. The sun began to set over the hills of Beverly, casting a warm glow over a family that might have been wealthy in gold, but was far richer in love, humor, and the kind of stubborn spirit that could never truly be drowned. They were the Clampetts, and as they always said, they were just glad to have folks dropping in to share a heap of their hospitality.